The Synoptic Gospels preserve different versions of a story of Jesus going to his hometown and teaching in the synagogue there. The response in Matthew's Gospel is that the hearers are astonished and begin to say to each other, "Where did this person get this wisdom and power? Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't Mary his mother? And aren't his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And aren't all his sisters among us? Where then did he get all these things?" And they were offended at him. Or, as Mark puts it, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him?" This is a question that is taken up in the early church in a variety of ways, notably in ways that suggest antagonism between what Jesus has learned and the wisdom he embodies and his Jewish heritage and Jewish context. This is most evident in the later Christian infancy gospel of Thomas, which purports to cover that period between Jesus' birth and Jesus' appearance in the temple at the age of 12. And the infancy gospel is largely about the education, or more aptly, the non-education of Jesus during this period. 4 episodes in this infancy gospel deal directly with the question of Jesus' education and seek to answer quite negatively the question, where did this man get this wisdom? Negatively in the sense of it couldn't have been from Jewish teachers. It couldn't have been from his cultural and religious context. It must come from elsewhere. It must come from above, directly, apart from this stream, this channel of Jewish wisdom and teaching. In this infancy gospel, we find the 5-year-old Jesus stepping onto the scene as a bit of a problem child. He's playing in a dam that he had made up near a well, and a boy breaks up the dam and dries up the pools in which Jesus was playing, and so Jesus makes the boy dry up and wither. Another boy who carelessly bumps him in the street drops dead as a result on the spot. And so the residents of Nazareth get onto Joseph for not controlling his son better, and a teacher, a Jewish teacher named Zacchaeus, offers to educate Jesus and make him fit for human company. And Joseph responds to this teacher, expressing his own exasperation. Who is able to teach such a boy? And the stories will show that no one is able or qualified to teach such a boy as Jesus was. Zacchaeus tries to teach Jesus something as straightforward as the alphabet, and Jesus puts him to shame with his superior knowledge of the formation of the letters and the mysteries that the shapes of the letters contain. Zacchaeus gives up, and in a few more years, another teacher is in fact sought out by Joseph to teach Jesus letters. And this teacher tries to teach Jesus Greek first, and then plans to teach him Hebrew. But again, Jesus challenges the teacher with having inferior knowledge to himself. And so this teacher strikes Jesus in exasperation. Jesus curses him, and he falls into a coma. After yet some more time, a third teacher approaches Joseph, offering to teach Jesus, to take him on as a pupil, and planning to use flattery to get Jesus to learn and cooperate. Jesus enters the teacher's classroom and sees a scroll there on a table, but he doesn't read the scroll. Instead, he just starts teaching the law to those who are standing around. A large crowd gathered and stood there listening to him in awe of the well-prepared quality of his speech, because as a mere child he was able to discourse about the law with such authority. Joseph heard what was going on and feared the worst for the third teacher. But when he got there, to his relief, he found the third teacher was fine, and the teacher basically confesses, I took this child on as a student, but he's so full of grace and wisdom, you should just take him back to your house. I have nothing to teach him. And Jesus approves of this teacher's attitude, and because of this teacher's humility before Jesus, Jesus also allows a second teacher finally to come out of his coma as well. The fourth episode takes us to the familiar story of Jesus in the temple, although this time we find Jesus not as we do in Luke, listening and asking questions. Now we find him questioning the teachers closely, almost interrogating. In one manuscript it says silencing the teachers, and explaining the chief points of the law and the parables of the prophets to them. So again, at the climactic story of the infancy gospel of Thomas, Jesus does not appear in anything like the position of a learner, but as an antagonist and a superior teacher already. And that's basically where that gospel ends. The picture in Luke's gospel is quite different. There we do in fact see Jesus inquiring deeply into his Jewish heritage, and we get no sense from that story of his antagonism, of his presuming, in fact, to teach, although he does ask perceptive questions, which win the admiration of the teachers around him. It's much more conversational, and certainly not one way in terms of Jesus teaching the Jewish scribes, but even the Jewish scribes teaching Jesus. And Jesus being portrayed as, from an early age, very interested in exploring and sifting through the heritage of his people. And perhaps then beginning to formulate his own understanding of God's will for God's people, how God desires God's covenant to be fulfilled among Israel. The more canonical version asks us to ask about Jesus. What did Jesus' Jewish milieu contribute to his own proclamation of God's desires for humankind and his understanding of his own calling? And of course, conversely, to inquire where exactly and for what reasons Jesus took issue with the tradition, or some of the traditions, because it was quite a varied pool in his context. Protestants especially tend to underestimate the answer to the first question, and therefore exaggerate and distort their understanding of the second. That is to say, operating basically with the Old Testament and the New Testament and nothing else, we tend to see a Jesus who belongs less in his Jewish context, and who speaks far more that is foreign to his Jewish context. One of the reasons that I urge my students to read the Apocrypha, and even more widely than the Apocrypha in terms of acquainting themselves with the literature of Second Temple Judaism, is that this fills in a very important gap in our knowledge of the development of Judaism, and therefore our knowledge of the range of resources that would have been available to Jesus and his brothers and the other formative voices and personalities of the early church than we could have if we just relied on the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. Perhaps one of the most important texts among the Apocrypha is the wisdom of Ben Sira, particularly when it comes to sifting through Jesus' teachings and inquiring about the connections between what Jesus had to say and what was already being said and affirmed in first century Judea. The Wisdom of Ben Sira is a rather distinctive book in that we know who wrote it, and we know when and where. We have more knowledge about this author than, I would say, any other author among the Apocrypha or Pseudepigrapha, certainly. Ben Sira was a teacher in a reputable school in Jerusalem who operated around 200 BC for a few decades, no doubt, perhaps on one or the other side of 200 or equally divided. And he preserved his wisdom, preserved the gems of his curriculum for posterity in writing himself. He gives us 51 chapters of a sampling of his curriculum. And what we find across that curriculum, alongside practical advice about how to navigate friendships and politics and financial matters, what we find is a deep commitment to the law of Moses and a deep desire to continue to nurture this commitment in the next generation. Now, 200 BC and the decades following were a time in which many of the elites in Judea were questioning the advantage of remaining committed to what was seeming increasingly a parochial way of life that merely cut off Judea from the larger, increasingly Hellenized world. They began to think very seriously about leaving behind some of the Torah-driven prescriptions for their civic, their political, and economic lives in order first to make Greeks and other people of other races feel more at home in Jerusalem, feel more comfortable doing business in Jerusalem and with people in Jerusalem, as well as pursuing those avenues that would make them, as Judeans, more accessible to the dominant culture's representatives, the Greeks, the members of the administration of the Hellenistic kingdoms that owned Judea in effect, whether that be the Ptolemies in Egypt until 198 BC or the Seleucids in Syria after 198 BC. So Ben Sira was a rather conservative voice in an increasingly progressive, and here are the quotation marks around progressive, elite in Judea. And so he could easily emerge as a kind of hero of Torah observance and defender of Torah observance on the eve of what would become a radical reform of Jerusalem, when the Torah was set aside as the constitution of the land, and a Greek constitution patterned after the Athenian constitution was adopted as the new basis for the polity of Jerusalem. And of course that story does not end well for the inhabitants of Jerusalem, as 1 Maccabees 1 and 2 and 2 Maccabees 3 through 7 tell so poignantly. Ben Sira, though, was well poised to enter the mainstream of Jewish wisdom and to have his teachings carried on by later generations throughout the Hasmonean and the Roman periods. In fact, fragments of the Hebrew text, the original, it was written down in Hebrew, the Hebrew text of his book were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here's a picture of a fragment of Ben Sira discovered among the ruins of Masada. So at least among Essene circles, and perhaps also Zealot circles, Ben Sira was respected. Ben Sira, the text of Ben Sira was taken to Egypt, where further copies of the Hebrew text have been found, and where Ben Sira's own grandson translated the work into Greek for the benefit of the Jewish community there, specifically, as he puts it, for the benefit of those who are seeking to live a Torah-observant life. And also in Egypt, remnants of medieval Hebrew manuscripts of Ben Sira have been found. Ben Sira is in fact quoted quite a bit in rabbinic literature. So he was clearly a respected and weighty teacher and resource for the leaders of rabbinic Judaism. I believe it was Solomon Schechter, the rabbinic scholar, who tallied the citations of Ben Sira or the unattributed allusions to Ben Sira in rabbinic literature, especially the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds, and found about 100 such citations or other indications of influence. Now, there were, of course, discussions in the early rabbinic period about the scriptural authority of Ben Sira, and there the unanimous judgment is that Ben Sira's writings are not canonical. The book of Ben Sira and all the other books written from then on do not defile the hands, is how the language goes in the Tosefta Yadayim. That is to say, they do not communicate holiness. They are not sacred texts. However, Ben Sira continued to be a highly influential text. He was clearly considered a colleague and even a teacher among the rabbis. His wisdom would likely then have been incorporated into the teachings that Jesus and his brothers heard in the synagogues of Nazareth and elsewhere, even among those teachers in Jerusalem, in that scene of Jesus spending several days among the teachers in the temple, in Ben Sira's own old hometown. No doubt his precepts continued to be quoted and passed along. All that to say, Ben Sira was in a very good position to be heard in the synagogues where Jesus and his family grew up, and therefore exercise some degree of influence, have some sort of contribution to make to Jesus' own formation as a teacher of the law and a teacher of Jewish tradition. When we turn to Jesus' teachings, those attributed to Jesus, for example, in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, we begin to find a lot of correspondences between what Jesus teaches and what Yehoshua ben Sira had taught about 2 centuries before in Jerusalem. When we read the antitheses, the so-called antitheses at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount after the Beatitudes, they're almost always translated to suggest that something was said of old, but now something different is being said by Jesus. And while this is certainly true of some of these antitheses, particularly those having to do with divorce and oath-taking and hating one's enemy, which really was never part of the Hebrew scriptural tradition as an instruction anyway, but be that as it may. The opening two are not antithetical at all. Instead, what Jesus does is extend the applicability of one of the commandments to a greater area of human experience. This fluidity is seen in the Greek particle de. We don't have access to presumably Jesus' original Aramaic, but the way it's been preserved in Greek, the conjunction de doesn't really correspond either to our English and or but. It's sort of a blend of the two, and according to some discourse scholars, really neither and or but more a marker of a progression in argumentation, a step forward in argumentation, which then becomes very difficult to translate. But we could really hear these first antitheses more as, and I say to you, and I say further to you. So what are these texts? You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. And I further say to you, that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. And I say further to you, that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now this extension of the commandment to cover not just murder, but other behaviors as well that contribute to failing to affirm the life of a brother or sister, appears already in Ben Sira. He writes, the bread of the needy is the life of the poor. Whoever deprives them of it is a murderer. To take away a neighbor's living is to commit murder. To deprive an employee of wages is to shed blood. And then in another place he writes, remember the commandments and do not be angry with your neighbor. Remember the covenant of the Most High and overlook faults. Now in the first, most clearly, Ben Sira has reflected on the commandment prohibiting murder and suggested that really God's intent there is not simply to refrain from putting a blade in the Judean beside you, but to keep oneself from all manner of actions that contribute to driving a neighbor out of life toward death. And in this passage he focuses especially on economic practices. If you deprive your neighbor of a living, you may not be putting a blade in his chest yourself, but you certainly are contributing to setting him on the path toward starvation and deprivation. So obviously the prohibition against murder teaches us not to do anything that contributes to the taking away of life from one's neighbor. This is the same sort of move that we find Jesus making interpretatively, namely extending the range of a commandment beyond its narrowest applicability to become a principle that guides a far wider range of practice than one might originally have suspected. We find later in Matthew 5 Jesus teaching about almsgiving, generosity, beneficence toward others, especially those who have not been, nor are likely ever to be, beneficent toward one in return, as the means of imitating God, showing oneself to be a child of the heavenly parent. So Jesus teaches, give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. This is a teaching, a concept that had already appeared in the teachings of Ben Sira. He writes, do not reject a suppliant in distress, or turn your face away from the poor. Do not avert your eye from the needy, and give no one reason to curse you. Be a father to orphans, and be like a husband to their mother, and you will then be like a child of the Most High, and he will love you more than does your mother. Again, likeness with God, relationship with God as child to parent, manifests itself in generosity toward those in need. Something Jesus learned from the heritage of Ben Sira, and also the book Tobit is very strong on promoting almsgiving, charity, generosity toward the needy as essential to keeping God's covenant. Ben Sira gave the advice, do not babble in the assembly of the elders, and do not repeat yourself when you pray. Conciseness in making one's needs known to God was already part of the Jewish tradition. When Jesus said, when you are praying, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard because of their many words. So here, although Jesus compares overly effusive prayers to Gentile religious practice, and rightly so. I mean, what we have found of Gentile prayers are highly repetitious, highly redundant, almost as if one could badger the gods into complying through many words. But positively, what Jesus is urging here, to pray simply to the God who already knows what you need, is well in line with his tradition. Even more striking, Jesus' teaching about forgiveness, which finds expression in the heart of the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. The one petition in the Lord's Prayer which receives comment the way Matthew has arranged Jesus' teachings. For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. This teaching, which could strike us as quite revolutionary, just reading Matthew, really was not revolutionary at all in Judea. Jesus was reminding his audience of something that other teachers, other Jewish teachers, had also put forward as the proper ethos among Judeans, namely mutual forgiveness. Ben Sira had taught, again, 2 or more centuries before, forgive your neighbor the wrong he has done, and then your sins will be pardoned when you pray. Does a person harbor anger against another and yet seek for healing from the Lord? Do they have no mercy toward human beings like themselves, and yet pray for their own sins? The implication, of course, being something very similar to what we find in Jesus' parable of the unforgiving servant. The provocation that we offer God and God's honor through our disobedience is exponentially greater than the provocation that our neighbor offers us, or works against our honor when they wrong us. Therefore, failing to forgive the neighbor is in effect already an insult against God. Whereas the willingness to forgive one's neighbor and then go to God for forgiveness is a testimony to the fact that that I, as a human, understand my honor to be nothing in comparison with God's honor. So of course, if I expect God to forgive my provocations of His honor through my disobedience, of course I, a person of much lesser honor, am going to forgive provocations against my own honor. Luke preserves a story that Jesus told about a Pharisee and a tax collector who went up to the temple to pray. And of course, Jesus holds up the tax collector as exemplary for how to approach God, and the Pharisee as exemplary for how not to approach God. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. And the word justified there is significant. Who is right with God? Is it the Pharisee or is it the tax collector? Who leaves the temple aligned with God? The lesson Jesus is teaching here is not, again, new to Judea. It was something that Ben Sira also perceived in regard to how one stands before God. And he writes, do not commit a sin twice. Even for one, you will not go unpunished. Don't say, He will consider the multitude of my gifts, and when I make an offering to the Most High God, He will accept it. The point there, of course, is one cannot presume upon God's mercy. And however much one gives to the temple, or whatever one makes in the way of offerings, does not buy God's approval. In a similar way, the Pharisee assumes that his piety, fasting twice a week, and his accuracy in tithing buy God's approval. Whereas, the way Jesus puts it, no, understanding oneself to be a sinner, and to rely wholly on God's mercy, and to have no claim before God, is the proper way to approach God. As we touched on already a moment ago, Ben Sira was a great promoter of almsgiving, charity toward one's fellow Jews who were in need. He writes, "Help the poor for the commandment's sake, and in their need do not send them away empty-handed. Lose your silver for the sake of a brother or a friend, and do not let it rust under a stone and be lost. Lay up your treasure according to the commandments of the Most High, and it will profit you more than gold. Store up almsgiving in your treasury, and it will rescue you from every disaster." Now, hearers who are familiar with Jesus' teachings will probably already hear some interesting resonances when Ben Sira says that the wrong way to use money is to hoard it so that it rusts and is lost. When Ben Sira says that the way to lay up a treasure with God is to give away one's money to those in need. When when Ben Sira writes that almsgiving is a way to store up a treasury that will matter in the day of need, we're probably already hearing what Jesus has to say about the right use of wealth beyond our necessities. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. Luke especially is more direct about how to store up treasures in heaven. Sell your possessions and give alms. Make purses for yourselves that don't wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. Or as Jesus puts it to the young rich man, if you wish to be perfect, and remember the context, the young man wants assurance that he has indeed fulfilled God's commandments, and has just claimed that he has in fact fulfilled the commandment to love his neighbor as himself. But Jesus knows that he hasn't, as long as he sits on a hoard of wealth and his neighbor lacks daily bread. So he says, if you wish to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And what Jesus says to him alone, he does say to all would-be disciples earlier in Luke's gospel, as we just saw. Now this idea, which seems so radical, and in fact Jesus does radicalize it. Ben Sira would never have said, sell your possessions and give alms, and come follow me. But the kernel of Jesus' teaching is there in Ben Sira. The way to use your wealth that has value in God's sight, value forever, is to use it to relieve the needs of your neighbors, brothers, sisters. When Jesus invites disciples to come learn from him, to make themselves his disciples, he uses language that is very similar to the language used by Ben Sira himself, and so might suggest that Jesus understood himself as a teacher of wisdom, a teacher of the way to fulfill God's commands correctly in God's sight, advantageously in regards to one's relationship with God. He invites people, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The images of taking on a yoke, of finding rest, of discipleship, of learning, not being a great burden, but actually a path to internal rest. I hesitate to say ease, but at least to peace. All of this was found already in Ben Sira's invitation to students. Draw near to me, you who are untaught, and lodge in my school. Put your neck under the yoke, and let your souls receive instruction. It is to be found close by. See with your eyes that I have labored little and found for myself much rest. A similar sort of invitation, again, not suggesting that Jesus is setting up a school, but that he is standing in line and presenting himself in line with teachers of Jewish wisdom. Now, having explored all of these areas in which we could find the imprint of Ben Sira's ethics in Jesus' teachings, having seen all that, we should not close our eyes also to points of differentiation. But we could see these points of differentiation much more clearly and much more accurately for having seen the points of commonality, the places where Jesus has embraced and incorporated what had been taught by the much older Jewish sage. I'm not, by the way, suggesting that Jesus read the scroll of the wisdom of Ben Sira. I am merely suggesting that Jesus was able to internalize through his conversation partners, through his own teachers in the synagogues, much of what Ben Sira had taught and had injected into the stream of Jewish ethics. But Jesus goes further and goes differently than Ben Sira at many points, and this is also worth considering. First, Jesus displays a much more thoroughgoing tendency to radicalize the ethical instructions of the Torah and earlier Jewish interpretations of Torah and the formation Torah sought to accomplish. He goes much further than Ben Sira in regard to murder and adultery, and also divorce and oaths, prohibiting divorce and oaths entirely. It is also evident in his extension of the commandment to love one's neighbor, to include loving one's enemy, something that Ben Sira himself neither taught nor appears practiced. So Jesus pushes much further than Ben Sira in these ways. So, for example, Ben Sira instructed students not to reject a suppliant in distress or turn your face away from the poor, but he did also advise directing one's generosity to the pious, to the good, to the Torah observant. Jesus extends the command to be generous to include all suppliants, not just those who are pursuing righteousness or even are treating one well. Ben Sira prescribed limits for generosity on the basis of his own perception that even God hates sinful people, and therefore, we shouldn't be supporting them either. But Jesus taught the transcendence of these limits on the basis of his own perception that God makes his sun to rise on the wicked and on the good, and sends the gift of rain for the unjust as well as the just. So a much more radical understanding of God's generosity, yielding a more rigorous ethic in regard to generosity. Jesus also challenged certain boundaries that were upheld, even heightened, in texts like Ben Sira. This is particularly true in regard to his view of women and Samaritans. Ben Sira is infamous, actually, for what he has to say about women. To a large extent, he merely continues to foster the cultural stereotypes of the ideal woman, who is silent, submissive, and chaste. But he does go beyond the pale in quite a few things that he has to say, such as the birth of a daughter is a debit, thinking about the potential danger that a daughter can bring to the honor of the head of the household if she is in any way loose in her behavior. So Ben Sira is intent on confining women to the inner spaces of a house and restricting their access to male persons as much as possible. They don't belong in the space where they can interact with men, because the possibility of sexual engagement, and therefore the dishonoring of the male to whom the woman is conceptually attached, be it a father or husband or both, is too great. Jesus, however, invites women into the male spaces where disciples gather to learn from him, and he values women as both disciples and witnesses. The story of Mary in Luke 10 is the most prominent example, as she abandons the proper women's spaces of the kitchen to sit in the company of the male disciples, unchaperoned. But then there are also other women that Luke names among the traveling companions of Jesus and his disciples. So Jesus' interest in in including women in the circle of disciples and speaking to them about the way that pleases God is far more important to him than perceptions of propriety and the restrictions on women coming into those spaces where men might gather. Now, of course, we know Jesus was no advocate of sexual looseness. If anything, he is one of the most radical in terms of what is proper between a man and a woman sexually. But he does not allow fear over those matters, obsession with the honor issues connected with the men attached to those women in such situations, to trump the value of including women among his circles of disciples and even witnesses. Related to this point, Jesus disagrees with Ben Sira in regard to when divorce is appropriate and on what grounds. Ben Sira has a very liberal point of view in regard to divorce. Liberal in the sense of giving the man a lot of leeway in terms of deciding when to cut off his wife from his flesh. Basically, if she does not follow the husband's instructions. And of course, he will also vent about the ways in which a bad wife can bring misery upon her husband, being talkative or financially independent or non-submissive, failing to look up to her husband and doing what she's told. Jesus, on the other hand, elevates God's intentions for marriage, as expressed in Genesis 2:24, above even the legal provision for divorce in the Torah. He says that Moses' allowance for divorce was a concession to the hardness of heart, hardness of the heart of the people. But both divorce and the failure of that other-centered love behind divorce fall short of God's purposes for human marriage. In this regard, Jesus is far more stringent than Ben Sira. Ben Sira harbors hostility against the Samaritans, and because he's a teacher, he fosters such hostility along the way. Toward the end of his book, we read him saying, "My soul is angry at two nations, and the third is not a nation, those living on Mount Seir, the Edomites, the Philistines, and the foolish people dwelling in Shechem." So of all these other groups, these groups of others, Edomites and Philistines and Samaritans, the Samaritans fare the worst in Ben Sira's estimation. But of course, especially in the Gospels of Luke and John, Jesus is famous for his affirmation of Samaria and the people from Samaria, using them as positive examples, for example, in the famous parable of the Good Samaritan, but also in the story of the 10 lepers, the only one of whom thought to turn to show gratitude to Jesus, and Luke points out that was a Samaritan. And of course, Jesus is remembered in John to have made Samaria a place of mission work, starting with the woman at the well, through whose testimony a whole village of Samaritans is exposed to Jesus, his wisdom, and come to believe in his person. Finally, we might think about the difference in support for the temple cult that we find between Ben Sira and Jesus. Ben Sira has a very high view of the temple and its priesthood when he elaborates the Shema, which is basically as close as you get to a creed in early Judaism, starting with Deuteronomy 6:4-6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is Lord alone, and you will love the Lord with all your soul, all your strength, all your might, and so forth. When Ben Sira elaborates on that language of the Shema, he does so in a manner that links devotion to God intimately with the priesthood and the temple cult. With all your soul, revere the Lord and admire his priests. With all your strength, love the one who made you and do not neglect his ministers. Fear the Lord and honor the priest and give him the portion commanded you. So in a passage like that, we see very clearly how Ben Sira brings support for and admiration for the temple cult and its personnel into the orbit of this central commandment of Judaism, to love the Lord with all your soul, all your strength, and so forth. Of course, when Jesus elaborates upon the Shema in his answer to the question, what's the most important commandment, he links it with a very different admonition, namely Leviticus 19:18. You will love your neighbor as yourself. While Ben Sira embeds support for the temple cult in the Shema, Jesus embeds one's daily relations with fellow Jews and other neighbors in the Shema. And of course, Jesus' prophetic denunciation of the temple and those entrusted with its administration is one of the few undisputed data of his career, as far as the varied questers of the historical Jesus have determined. What I hope this survey shows is that, on the one hand, yes, we will always find places of disagreement, even conflict between Jesus and other Jewish voices from the period. But we will also find, if we read, especially in the intertestamental literature, Second Temple Jewish literature, we will find that Jesus found much to affirm in his heritage and incorporated a great deal of it into his own thinking, his own reflection on the way of life that pleases God. And as those who wish to understand Jesus and the Gospels more fully, we need to continue to attend to this other literature as well, because it is a living and essential witness to the Judaism that nourished Jesus, as well as the Judaism with which Jesus and his followers took issue.